My mother died on a Tuesday in October, and by Friday, my brother had already started stealing from her estate.
I didn't know it then, of course. I was too busy grieving, planning the funeral, calling relatives, doing all the things you do when you lose a parent.
My brother Robert was being helpful, supportive. He handled the practical details while I dealt with the emotional ones. He met with the funeral director, contacted the estate attorney, started organizing Mom's financial documents. I was grateful. Robert and I had never been particularly close, but in that moment of shared loss, I thought maybe we were finally coming together as family should. I was wrong. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 58 years old, and this is the story of how my older brother, the executor of our mother's estate, stole $400,000 from our family inheritance, covered it up with forged documents, and nearly got away with it, and how a chance encounter in a coffee shop 6 months later revealed the truth and destroyed what was left of our family. Before I tell you about what Robert did, I need to tell you about our mother. Helen Mitchell was 79 years old when she died. She'd been a public school teacher for 35 years, retired in 2008, and spent her retirement volunteering at the library, tending her garden, and spoiling her 4 grandchildren. She wasn't wealthy by any measure, but she was careful with money. She and my father had bought their house in 1978 for $60,000. By the time Mom died, that house in a desirable Seattle neighborhood was worth over $600,000. Dad had passed away 12 years earlier from a heart attack. Mom had lived alone in that house ever since, refusing our suggestions that she downsize or move to a retirement community. The house was her independence, her memories, her connection to Dad. She'd updated her will after Dad died, making it very simple. Everything split equally between Robert and me. The house would be sold, and the proceeds divided 50-50. Her savings accounts, her small investment portfolio, her car, her belongings, all of it split down the middle. Robert was named executor because he was the oldest, because he lived in Seattle near Mom, while I was 3 hours away in Portland, and because Mom trusted him to handle the administrative details. I had no objection. Being executor is work, dealing with courts, creditors, tax filings, asset sales. I was happy to let Robert handle it while I focused on my own grief and my family. That trust was the biggest mistake of my life. Mom's funeral was on a Saturday. Nearly 200 people came. Former students, teaching colleagues, neighbors, friends from church. The service was beautiful. People shared stories about how Mom had impacted their lives, how she'd been kind and generous and patient. Robert gave the eulogy. He talked about how Mom had raised us to value education, integrity, and family, how she'd sacrificed to give us opportunities, how she'd been the anchor of our family. He cried during the eulogy. Real tears. I cried too, proud of my brother for honoring our mother so beautifully. Looking back now, I wonder if those tears were genuine or if Robert was already planning how to steal from Mom's estate and was crying from guilt rather than grief. The week after the funeral, Robert and I met with Mom's estate attorney, a man named Gerald Hoffman who'd handled her will, and Dad's estate years before. Gerald walked us through the process. As executor, Robert would need to file the will with probate court, notify creditors, inventory all assets, pay any outstanding debts, file final tax returns, and then distribute the remaining assets according to the will. The house would need to be sold, unless one of us wanted to buy out the other's share. Mom's financial accounts would need to be liquidated and the funds distributed. Personal property would need to be divided or sold. Gerald estimated the process would take 6 to 9 months, which was typical for an estate of this size. He asked if Robert and I had any questions or concerns about the will or the distribution. I said no. Everything seemed fair and straightforward. Robert said he'd handle everything properly and keep me informed every step of the way. Gerald seemed satisfied. He gave Robert the necessary paperwork and told him to call if he had questions. We left the attorney's office together. Robert suggested we get coffee and talk about next steps. We sat in a Starbucks near Gerald's office, drinking lattes neither of us really wanted, trying to navigate the awkward combination of grief and business that comes with settling a parent's estate. Robert said he'd start organizing Mom's financial documents, getting the house ready to sell, sorting through her belongings. I offered to come up on weekends to help, but Robert said there was no rush. He'd handle the initial work and let me know when he needed assistance. I asked about the house sale timeline. Robert said he'd talk to a real estate agent, get the house appraised, and probably listed in the spring when the market was stronger. That made sense. It was November. Waiting a few months for better market conditions seemed prudent. Robert asked if there was anything of Mom's I particularly wanted: furniture, jewelry, personal items. I said I wanted Mom's recipe box and her photo albums, maybe some of her books. Robert said, of course, he'd set those aside for me. We finished our coffee and hugged in the parking lot. Robert told me he loved me and that we'd get through this together. I believed him. Over the next several months, Robert sent me occasional updates via email. In December, he wrote that he'd hired an estate sale company to handle Mom's furniture and household items. The sale had generated about $8,000 after fees. In January, he reported that he'd met with a real estate agent and gotten the house appraised at $620,000. He planned to list it in March. In February, he said the house was being staged and would go on the market the first week of March. In April, he sent a brief email saying the house had sold and would close in early May. Each email was professional, informative, and seemingly transparent. Robert was handling everything exactly as he'd promised. I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The first warning sign came in May, when Robert sent me a detailed accounting of the estate settlement. According to his documentation, here's what the estate had consisted of. Mom's house sold for $320,000.
Mom's savings accounts, $42,000.
Mom's investment account, $38,000. Mom's car sold for $6,000. Estate sale proceeds, $8,000.
Total estate value, $408,000.
After paying Mom's final medical bills, funeral expenses, estate attorney fees, real estate commissions, and various other costs, the net distributable estate was $340,000. My share, $170,000. Robert included copies of all the relevant documents. The closing statement from the house sale showing the $320,000 sale price, bank statements showing the account balances, receipts for all the expenses. Everything looked legitimate and professionally documented. Robert's email said he'd wire my share to my account within a week as soon as the final probate paperwork was processed. I read through everything carefully. The numbers seemed reasonable. Houses in Mom's neighborhood typically sold for anywhere from $300,000 to $700,000 depending on condition and lot size. Mom's house was older and needed updates, so $320,000 seemed plausible, if perhaps on the lower end. I felt a small pang of disappointment that the estate wasn't larger, but I certainly wasn't complaining about receiving $170,000. It was more money than I'd ever had at one time. I replied thanking Robert for handling everything so professionally. I told him I appreciated all the work he'd done and that Mom would be proud of how he'd managed her affairs. A week later, $170,000 appeared in my bank account. I paid off my mortgage, set aside money for my kids' college funds, put some in savings for retirement. The inheritance gave me financial security I'd never had before. I was grateful to Mom for being so careful with money and grateful to Robert for managing the estate so competently. I thought that was the end of it. The estate was settled. Mom's house was sold. The inheritance was distributed. We could all move forward. But 6 months later, in November, almost exactly 1 year after Mom's death, I discovered the truth. It started with a chance encounter at a coffee shop in Seattle. I was in town visiting friends and had stopped at a small cafe in Mom's old neighborhood. I was waiting for my latte when a woman approached me. She said, "Excuse me, are you Helen Mitchell's daughter?" I turned and saw a woman in her early 40s, holding a toddler's hand, looking at me with a warm smile. I said yes, I was Helen's daughter. The woman introduced herself as Jennifer Park. She said she was so sorry for my loss that she'd met my mother a few times when she'd been looking at houses in the neighborhood. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said, "We absolutely love the house. It's been wonderful for our family. Your mother would be so happy to know it's full of children and laughter again." I stared at her, confused. I asked what she meant. Jennifer looked surprised. She said, "Your mother's house. We bought it last spring. We've been living there since May." I felt dizzy. I managed to ask what they'd paid for the house. Jennifer hesitated, clearly sensing something was wrong. Then she said, $605,000. Why? $605,000. Robert had told me the house sold for $320,000, a difference of $285,000. I must have looked ill, because Jennifer asked if I was okay, if I needed to sit down. I made some excuse about not feeling well and left the coffee shop in a daze. I sat in my car in the parking lot, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Jennifer was confused about the price. Maybe she was thinking of a different house. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But I knew I hadn't misunderstood, and I knew Jennifer had no reason to lie about what she'd paid for the house, which meant Robert had lied to me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and found the email Robert had sent with the estate accounting. I opened the attachment showing the closing statement. The document clearly stated the sale price, $320,000. But Jennifer Park had just told me she paid $605,000 for the same house. Someone was lying, and I was starting to realize it wasn't Jennifer. I drove to Mom's old neighborhood, parked across the street from the house where I'd grown up, where Mom had lived for over 40 years. There were toys in the front yard now, a new mailbox, fresh paint on the trim. The Park family had made it their home. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the house, trying to process what was happening. Robert had lied about the sale price of Mom's house. He'd provided me with documentation showing a sale price of $320,000, but the house had actually sold for $605,000, a difference of $285,000. Money that should have been split between us. Money that Robert had kept for himself. My brother had stolen $142,500 from me, from our mother's estate, from the inheritance she'd intended us to share equally. The grief I'd been carrying for the past year suddenly mixed with a new emotion. Rage. I needed proof. I needed to be absolutely certain before I confronted Robert. I drove to the King County Records office and requested the official closing documents for Mom's property. Public real estate transactions are public record, accessible to anyone. The clerk handed me a copy of the deed transfer and the closing statement. Sale price, $605,000. Buyers Jennifer and Michael Park. Date, May 15th. Everything Jennifer had told me was accurate and documented in official county records. I sat in the records office, staring at the documents, feeling something break inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was deliberate fraud. Robert had created fake closing documents showing a lower sale price. He'd pocketed the difference, and he'd given me falsified paperwork to cover his theft. My brother had looked me in the eye, told me he loved me, hugged me at Mom's funeral, and then systematically stolen from both of us, from Mom's memory and from me. I called my husband Tom from the parking lot, told him what I'd discovered. He was quiet for a long moment, then said I needed to get a lawyer immediately. He was right. This wasn't something I could handle on my own. I contacted a friend who practiced family law and asked for a referral to an attorney who handled estate disputes. She gave me the name of a lawyer named Catherine Brennan, who specialized in executor misconduct and estate litigation. I met with Catherine 2 days later in her downtown Seattle office. I brought everything I had: Robert's emails, the fake closing documents he'd provided, the real closing documents from the county, Jennifer Park's contact information. Catherine reviewed everything methodically, taking notes, asking questions. She confirmed what I already suspected. Robert had committed serious crimes. As executor, he had a fiduciary duty to manage the estate honestly and transparently. By falsifying documents and stealing estate assets, he'd violated that duty and likely committed multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and forgery. Catherine said we had 2 options. First, we could file a civil lawsuit against Robert for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking to recover the stolen funds plus damages and attorney fees. This would be handled in probate court and could result in Robert being ordered to repay the money and being removed as executor. Second, we could report Robert to law enforcement for criminal prosecution. Theft of this magnitude was a felony that could result in prison time. Catherine recommended doing both. The civil case would focus on recovering the money and correcting the estate distribution. The criminal case would hold Robert accountable for his actions and potentially deter him from hiding or spending the stolen funds. I asked how certain she was that we could prove Robert's theft. Catherine said the evidence was overwhelming. The county records proved the actual sale price. Robert's documentation proved he'd provided false information. The discrepancy was clear and undeniable.
She said we'd also want to investigate whether Robert had stolen anything else from the estate. If he'd lied about the house sale price, he might have lied about other assets too.
Catherine recommended hiring a forensic accountant to examine all of Mom's financial records and compare them against Robert's estate accounting. I authorized her to proceed with both the civil lawsuit and the criminal complaint, and I hired the forensic accountant she recommended, a man named Thomas Whitfield, who specialized in estate fraud cases. The next step was the hardest, confronting Robert. Catherine advised against it. She said Robert might destroy evidence or transfer the stolen money somewhere we couldn't recover it if he knew we were onto him. But I needed to hear it from him. I needed to look my brother in the eye and ask him why. I called Robert and said I needed to talk to him about some questions I had regarding the estate. I kept my voice neutral, giving no indication that I knew what he'd done. Robert suggested we meet for lunch the following weekend. We met at a restaurant in downtown Seattle. Robert arrived looking relaxed and friendly. He hugged me, asked about my family, made small talk about the holidays. We ordered food, made conversation about work and kids and mundane things.
Then I pulled out the county closing documents and slid them across the table.
I said I met Jennifer Park a few weeks ago. She told me what they paid for Mom's house. Robert's face went pale. He picked up the documents, stared at them, and I watched him trying to formulate a response. Finally, he said it must be a mistake, that the county records were wrong. I pulled out his fake closing statement and put it next to the real one. I said, one of these documents is wrong, Robert. Either the county made a $300,000 error in their official records, or you created fake documents to hide the fact that you stole from Mom's estate. Robert was quiet. His hands were shaking slightly. I asked him directly, did you steal from Mom's estate? He didn't answer right away. Then he started talking, his words coming out in a rush. He said he'd been planning to tell me that he'd made some bad investments and lost money, that he'd borrowed from the estate temporarily, planning to pay it back, that he'd gotten in over his head and didn't know how to fix it. I listened to him make excuses, watched him try to minimize what he'd done. Then I asked the question I needed answered. Why? Why had he stolen from our mother's estate? From me? From our family? Robert's face crumpled. He said he needed the money, that his business was failing, that he had debts, that he'd made mistakes and was desperate. He said he'd rationalized, that I was getting plenty of money, that $170,000 was still a generous inheritance, that I wouldn't miss what I never knew I was supposed to have. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I listened to him justify stealing from his own sister from his dead mother's estate. I told him that I'd hired a lawyer, that I was filing a civil lawsuit and a criminal complaint, that a forensic accountant was reviewing all of Mom's financial records to determine if he'd stolen anything else. Robert's expression changed from remorse to fear. He started begging me not to involve the police, said we could work this out as family, that he'd pay me back. I asked how he planned to pay back $142,000 when he claimed to be broke. He didn't have an answer. I stood up to leave. Robert grabbed my arm, asked me to please reconsider, to think about his kids, his reputation, his future. I pulled my arm away and told him he should have thought about those things before he decided to commit fraud. I left the restaurant and drove home to Portland, crying the entire 3 hours. I wasn't just grieving my mother anymore. I was grieving my brother, my family, the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. Catherine filed the civil lawsuit in probate court the following week. The complaint detailed Robert's theft, his falsified documents, and his breach of fiduciary duty as executor. The criminal complaint was filed with the King County Prosecutor's Office, outlining the evidence of theft and fraud, and Thomas Whitfield, the forensic accountant, began his examination of Mom's estate. What he found was worse than I'd imagined. The house sale wasn't the only thing Robert had lied about. Thomas Whitfield was a methodical man in his early 60s who'd spent 30 years examining financial records for fraud cases. He had a reputation for finding discrepancies that others missed, for following paper trails that seemed to lead nowhere, for reconstructing financial histories from incomplete records. When I first met him in his office, he told me that estate fraud cases were among the most difficult to prove because executors had legitimate access to all assets and could manipulate records with relative ease. But he also said that most people who committed fraud made mistakes. They got sloppy. They left traces. He asked me to provide everything I had, Robert's emails, his estate accounting, any documents he'd given me, my mother's old financial statements if I had them, contact information for her banks and investment firms. I gave him everything I could find. Mom had been organized, keeping files of bank statements and investment reports going back years. I'd taken those files from her house before Robert could dispose of them, thinking I might want them for sentimental reasons. Those files became the foundation of Thomas's investigation.
He started with the bank accounts. He called Mom's bank, identified himself as a forensic accountant working on an estate dispute, and requested complete account histories for all accounts in Helen Mitchell's name.
The bank's records showed that Mom's primary savings account had contained $62,312 on the day she died. Robert had provided me with a bank statement showing $42,000. Thomas examined the statement Robert had given me. It was a forgery, but a sophisticated one. Robert had used the bank's actual statement template, matching fonts and formatting precisely. He'd changed only the account balance and the transaction history. The giveaway was subtle. The statement Robert provided had a slightly different shade of blue in the bank's logo. He'd scanned a real statement and edited it digitally, but hadn't matched the color precisely. Thomas documented the discrepancy with side-by-side comparisons and detailed notes explaining how he'd identified the forgery. Then he moved to the investment account. Mom had maintained a modest portfolio with a regional investment firm, mostly index funds and bonds. The firm's records showed the account value on the date of her death, $55,647. Robert's documentation showed $38,000. Another forged statement. Another $17,000 theft. Thomas cross-referenced every document Robert had provided against authentic records from financial institutions. Each time, he found discrepancies. Each time, the authentic records showed higher values than Robert's fabricated documents. The pattern was undeniable and systematic, but Thomas didn't stop with the obvious frauds. He looked for things I hadn't even thought to question. He examined the estate sale proceeds. Robert had said the sale generated $8,000. Thomas contacted the estate sale company directly. The company's records showed they'd sold Mom's furniture and household items for a total of $12,400. After their 20% commission, they'd given Robert a check for $9,920. Robert had pocketed nearly $4,000 and reported a lower amount. Thomas found similar discrepancies with the car sale. Robert claimed he'd sold Mom's Honda Accord to a private buyer for $6,000. But Thomas obtained DMV records showing the car had been sold to a used car dealership for $9,500. Every single asset Robert had liquidated, he'd lied about the proceeds. Thomas created a comprehensive spreadsheet documenting each discrepancy. House, actual value $605,000, reported $320,000, difference $285,000. Savings account, actual $62,000, reported $42,000, difference $20,000. Investment account, actual $55,000, reported $38,000, difference $17,000. Estate sale, actual proceeds $9,900, reported $8,000, difference $1,900. Car sale, actual $9,500, reported $6,000, difference $3,500. Total theft, $328,400. But Thomas wasn't finished. He noticed something else in Mom's financial records that troubled him. In the 6 months before Mom's death, there had been unusual withdrawals from her checking account. 5 separate withdrawals of $5,000 each, all made at ATMs. $25,000 withdrawn in cash over 6 months. Mom had been in declining health during that period. She'd rarely left the house. She certainly hadn't been going to ATMs to withdraw large amounts of cash. Thomas asked if I knew anything about these withdrawals. I didn't. Mom had never mentioned needing cash, and $5,000 at a time seemed excessive for someone who paid most bills electronically or by check. Thomas said he suspected Robert had been stealing from Mom even before she died, that he'd likely had access to her ATM card and PIN, possibly under the guise of helping her with errands and banking. If that was true, Robert hadn't just stolen from the estate after Mom died. He'd been stealing from her while she was alive and vulnerable. The thought made me physically ill. Thomas suggested I ask other family members if they'd witnessed Robert having unusual access to Mom's finances in her final months. I called my Aunt Patricia, Mom's younger sister, asked her if she'd noticed anything odd about Robert's involvement in Mom's care toward the end. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said that about 8 months before Mom died, Robert had told the family that Mom was getting confused about her finances, that she was making mistakes with her checkbook, forgetting to pay bills, that he'd offered to help her manage her money to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. Patricia had thought it was kind of Robert to help Mom. She'd even praised him for being such an attentive son. Now, in light of everything else, it seemed more like Robert had been positioning himself to steal from Mom while she was still alive. I reported this information to Thomas. He added it to his analysis, noting that the suspicious ATM withdrawals began shortly after Robert claimed Mom was having financial difficulties. The picture that emerged from Thomas's investigation was devastating. Robert hadn't made a single impulsive mistake or taken advantage of one opportunity. He'd executed a calculated, long-term theft that began before Mom even died and continued for over a year afterward. He'd stolen from Mom when she was elderly and vulnerable. He'd stolen from her estate after she died. He'd created elaborate forgeries to cover his tracks. And he'd looked me in the eye and lied repeatedly while pretending to grieve and support me. Thomas's final report was 93 pages long. It included detailed analysis of every financial document, side-by-side comparisons of authentic records versus Robert's forgeries, timeline reconstructions of when each theft occurred, and calculations of the total amount stolen. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Catherine said the report was the most comprehensive estate fraud documentation she'd ever seen, that it would be devastating to Robert's defense, that no jury would have any doubt about what he'd done. She filed the report with both the probate court and the prosecutor's office. Robert's attorney requested a copy. I imagine he read it and realized his client had no viable defense. The legal proceedings moved forward simultaneously on both fronts. In probate court, Catherine filed a motion to remove Robert as executor and to freeze all estate assets until the matter could be resolved. The judge granted the motion, appointing a neutral third-party administrator to take over estate management. The criminal investigation proceeded more slowly. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Victoria Hayes, interviewed me, reviewed the forensic accounting, examined the falsified documents, and built her case methodically. Robert hired a criminal defense attorney, Marcus Webb, who immediately began trying to negotiate a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus knew that taking this case to trial would be foolish. But Victoria wasn't interested in an easy plea. The amount of money involved, the sophisticated nature of the fraud, and the violation of fiduciary duty made this a serious case that warranted serious consequences. 6 months after I'd met Jennifer Park in that coffee shop, Robert was formally charged with multiple felonies: first-degree theft, forgery, criminal fraud, and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 15 years in prison. Marcus tried to argue that this was a family dispute that should be handled civilly, not criminally. But Victoria pointed out that Robert's crimes weren't victimless. He'd stolen from a deceased person's estate, violated the explicit instructions in her will, and defrauded his own sister. The probate court proceedings concluded first. The judge ruled that Robert had committed egregious breaches of his fiduciary duty, had engaged in fraud and self-dealing, and had violated every principle of trust that governs executor responsibilities. Robert was ordered to return every penny he'd stolen, approximately $400,000 plus interest, attorney fees, and court costs. The judge's written opinion was scathing. He noted that executors hold positions of sacred trust, that they are tasked with honoring the wishes of the deceased and protecting the interests of heirs. Robert had violated that trust in the most reprehensible way possible. Robert was also permanently barred from serving as an executor, trustee, or fiduciary in any capacity in Washington state. But the real reckoning came in criminal court. The trial was set for September, nearly 2 years after Mom's death. Marcus made one last attempt to negotiate a plea deal that would avoid prison time. Victoria refused. The crimes were too serious, too calculated, too harmful. The trial lasted a week. Victoria methodically presented the evidence: the forensic accounting showing the true value of the estate, the fake documents Robert had created, the real documents from county records and financial institutions, my testimony about what Robert had told me and what I'd discovered. The most damning evidence was Robert's own words. Victoria had subpoenaed his emails and text messages. Among them were messages to his wife discussing how to spend the extra money from Mom's estate, messages to his financial advisor about investing an unexpected windfall. Robert had been so confident in his fraud that he'd put it in writing. The defense tried to argue that Robert had made accounting errors and poor judgment, but hadn't intended to commit crimes. The jury didn't buy it. The trial itself was a study in contrasts. On one side, Victoria Hayes presented a meticulous case built on documentary evidence and expert testimony. On the other, Marcus Webb tried desperately to paint Robert as a confused, overwhelmed man who'd made mistakes rather than a calculating thief. Jury selection had taken most of the first day. Victoria asked potential jurors about their experiences with family disputes, estate planning, and financial fraud. She wanted people who could separate family loyalty from legal responsibility. Marcus asked about their views on white-collar crime, whether they believed prison was appropriate for nonviolent offenses, whether they could be fair to someone who'd made financial mistakes under pressure. By late afternoon, 12 jurors and 2 alternates had been seated. 8 women, 4 men, ages ranging from mid-20s to early 70s. A mix of backgrounds and professions. They would decide Robert's fate. Opening statements began the second morning.
Victoria stood before the jury and spoke with calm authority.
She told them this was a case about trust and betrayal, about a man who'd been entrusted with sacred responsibility to honor his deceased mother's wishes and fairly distribute her estate, and who had violated that trust in the most calculated way possible. She explained that Robert hadn't made mistakes or errors in judgment. He'd committed deliberate, systematic theft. He'd created forged documents. He'd lied to his sister repeatedly. He'd stolen nearly $400,000 from his own mother's estate. Victoria told the jury they would see overwhelming evidence, authentic financial records that showed the true value of the estate, forged documents that showed false values, forensic accounting that proved exactly how much Robert had stolen. She said the evidence would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Robert Morrison had committed multiple felonies and deserved to be held accountable. Marcus Webb's opening statement took a different approach. He acknowledged that Robert had made serious mistakes, that he'd mishandled the estate, that his accounting had been inaccurate. But he argued that mistakes weren't crimes, that Robert had been overwhelmed by the complexity of settling an estate while grieving his mother, that he'd made poor decisions under stress, but hadn't intended to commit fraud. Marcus suggested that this was really a family dispute that should have been handled civilly rather than criminally, that I was angry and vindictive, that I was using the criminal justice system to punish my brother rather than seeking genuine justice. He asked the jury to consider Robert's lifetime of good character, his lack of criminal history, his role as a father and husband, his contributions to the community. Marcus said that Robert had already lost everything: his reputation, his career, his financial security. That prison would serve no purpose except revenge. I listened to Marcus's opening statement with mounting anger. He was trying to paint Robert as a victim, to minimize the calculated nature of his fraud, to make me seem vengeful rather than protective of Mom's wishes. But I trusted that the evidence would speak for itself. The prosecution's case began with Victoria calling Thomas Whitfield to the stand. Thomas testified for nearly 4 hours over 2 days. He walked the jury through his entire investigation, explaining how he'd examined every financial document, contacted every institution, verified every transaction. He presented side-by-side comparisons of the forged documents Robert had created versus the authentic records from banks and investment firms. He pointed out the subtle differences that identified the forgeries. He explained the significance of each discrepancy: the $285,000 difference in the house sale price, the $20,000 difference in the savings account, the $17,000 difference in the investment account. Thomas showed the jury his 93-page report, walking them through key sections that demonstrated the systematic nature of Robert's theft. Marcus cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest that Thomas's analysis was biased because I'd hired him, that he'd interpreted ambiguous evidence in ways that supported my narrative. But Thomas remained calm and professional. He pointed out that he hadn't interpreted anything. He'd simply compared Robert's documents against authentic records from financial institutions. The discrepancies were objective facts, not interpretations. Marcus asked if it was possible that Robert had made innocent mistakes, that he'd misunderstood account balances or misread documents. Thomas said no. The forgeries were too sophisticated to be mistakes. Robert had deliberately altered bank statements and closing documents to show lower values. That required intentional effort, not confusion. The jury seemed convinced. Several were taking detailed notes. Others nodded as Thomas explained his findings. After Thomas's testimony, Victoria called representatives from the various financial institutions. A bank manager testified about Mom's savings account, confirming the $62,000 balance and identifying Robert's statement as a forgery. An investment advisor testified about the $55,000 investment account and the forged statement showing $38,000. A real estate agent testified about the house sale, confirming the $605,000 sale price to the Park family. Jennifer Park herself testified, explaining that she and her husband had paid $605,000 for the house and providing copies of their closing documents. Each witness corroborated Thomas's findings. Each one added another layer of proof that Robert had deliberately lied about asset values. Then Victoria called me to the stand. I'd been dreading this moment, having to talk about Robert's betrayal in front of a courtroom full of strangers, having to relive the discovery process, the confrontation, the realization that my brother had spent over a year lying to me. Victoria asked me to describe my relationship with Robert before Mom's death. I explained that we'd never been particularly close, but had maintained a cordial sibling relationship, that I'd trusted him to handle the estate honestly. She asked me to describe the estate settlement process. I walked through Robert's emails, the documentation he'd provided, the $170,000 payment he'd sent me. Victoria asked if I'd had any reason to suspect Robert was lying. I said no. Everything he'd provided looked legitimate. I trusted him completely. She asked me to describe the moment I learned the truth. I told the jury about meeting Jennifer Park at the coffee shop, about her mentioning the $605,000 purchase price, about the shock and confusion I'd felt. Victoria asked what I'd done next. I described going to the county records office, obtaining the authentic closing documents, realizing that Robert had forged the estate paperwork. She asked how I'd felt in that moment. I paused, trying to find words for the complex mix of emotions. Betrayal, anger, grief, disbelief that my own brother could do this. I said I felt like I'd lost my brother the same way I'd lost my mother, that the person I'd thought he was didn't exist, that he'd been lying to me while pretending to love and support me. Several jurors looked sympathetic. One older woman was visibly emotional.
Victoria asked if I'd confronted Robert.
I described our meeting at the restaurant, Robert's initial denials, his eventual admission, his excuses about needing the money and planning to pay it back. She asked if I'd considered handling this privately as a family matter. I said I'd considered it briefly, but Robert had committed serious crimes. He'd violated Mom's explicit wishes in her will. He'd stolen from a deceased person's estate. That required legal consequences, not just family mediation. Victoria thanked me and turned me over to the defense for cross-examination. Marcus approached with a sympathetic expression that felt calculated and false. He asked if Robert and I had ever had conflicts over Mom's care or estate planning before her death. I said no. He asked if I'd been surprised by the amount of my inheritance. I said the $170,000 had seemed reasonable given what Robert had told me about the estate value. Marcus asked if I'd felt I deserved more. I said I deserved exactly what Mom's will specified, half of everything, which would have been approximately $270,000, not $170,000. He asked if I'd been motivated by money when I reported Robert to authorities. I said I'd been motivated by justice, by honoring Mom's wishes, by holding Robert accountable for crimes he'd committed. Marcus asked if I realized that sending Robert to prison would devastate his children. I felt anger flash through me at the manipulation, but I kept my voice steady. I said that Robert had devastated his own children when he chose to commit fraud, that his choices, not mine, had created this situation. Marcus asked if I'd tried to forgive Robert to work things out as family. I said that forgiveness and legal accountability weren't mutually exclusive, that I could potentially forgive Robert while still believing he needed to face consequences for his crimes. The cross-examination continued for another hour, with Marcus trying various angles to make me seem vindictive or money-motivated. But I'd prepared for this with Catherine, and I kept my answers calm and factual. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt exhausted but relieved. I'd told the truth. The jury had heard my perspective directly. The prosecution's case concluded with testimony from other witnesses who'd been affected by Robert's actions. My Aunt Patricia testified about Robert claiming Mom needed help with finances, which had given him access to her accounts. The estate sale company representative testified about the actual proceeds from Mom's belongings. The used car dealer testified about purchasing Mom's Honda for $9,500. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, another demonstration of Robert's systematic dishonesty. After 5 days of prosecution testimony, Victoria rested her case. The defense's case was brief and ineffective. Marcus called Robert's wife, Jennifer, to testify about what a good father and husband he was, how devoted he'd been to his mother, how stressed he'd been by her death. But, under cross-examination, Victoria got Jennifer to admit that Robert had suddenly had a lot of money to spend after Mom died, that he'd paid off debts, bought a new car, taken the family on an expensive vacation, that she'd asked where the money came from, and he'd said it was his inheritance. Marcus called Robert's business partner to testify that Robert's company had been struggling financially, that Robert had been under significant pressure. But Victoria got the partner to admit that Robert had never mentioned desperate financial need, had never asked for a loan or sought financial help. The defense witnesses actually seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case rather than weaken it. Then Marcus made the decision to put Robert on the stand. It was a calculated risk. Robert's testimony could humanize him to the jury, allow him to express remorse and explain his actions, but it would also expose him to cross-examination by Victoria. Robert took the stand, looking nervous. His voice shook as he was sworn in. Marcus walked him through his relationship with Mom, his role as executor, his handling of the estate. Robert testified that he'd been overwhelmed by the complexity of settling the estate, that he'd made mistakes in his accounting, that he'd misunderstood some of the financial documents. He said he'd never intended to steal from anyone, that he'd planned to correct the errors eventually, that everything had just gotten away from him. It was a weak defense, and Robert knew it. His testimony sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. Then Victoria stood up for cross-examination. She was methodical and devastating. She asked Robert to explain exactly how he'd misunderstood the house sale price. Robert stammered that he'd gotten confused about the paperwork. Victoria showed him the authentic closing documents from the county and the forged documents he'd created, asked him to explain how confusion could lead to creating an entirely fabricated closing statement with a false sale price. Robert couldn't answer. She asked him about the forged bank statements, how confusion could lead to creating fake statements showing lower account balances. Robert said he'd made mistakes copying information. Victoria asked why, if these were innocent mistakes, all of them resulted in him keeping more money and giving me less. Robert had no good answer. She walked him through each forgery, each lie, each theft, asked him to explain each one, watched him fumble for explanations that made no sense. Then she asked about the ATM withdrawals from Mom's account before she died. Robert's face went pale. He said he didn't remember those. Victoria showed him the bank records. $5,000 withdrawals over 6 months. Asked if he'd made those withdrawals. Robert admitted he had. Said Mom had asked him to get cash for her. Victoria asked what Mom needed $25,000 in cash for. Robert said she'd wanted to have cash on hand for emergencies. Victoria asked if he had any documentation of Mom requesting these withdrawals. Any notes, any witnesses, any evidence at all.
Robert admitted he didn't.
She asked if it was possible that he'd stolen $25,000 from his elderly, vulnerable mother in the months before she died. Marcus objected. Victoria withdrew the question, but the implication hung in the air. Robert's testimony had been a disaster for the defense. Closing arguments took place on Friday, a week after the trial began. Marcus made his final appeal for leniency. He argued that Robert had made terrible mistakes but didn't deserve prison, that he'd already lost everything, that mercy was appropriate. Then Victoria delivered her closing argument. She reminded the jury of the evidence, the forged documents, the systematic theft, the calculated lies, spanning over a year. She said this wasn't a story about mistakes or confusion. It was a story about greed and betrayal. Robert had been trusted with a sacred responsibility. He'd violated that trust in the most profound way possible. And when caught, he'd offered nothing but excuses and lies. Victoria said the jury had a responsibility to hold Robert accountable, to send a message that stealing from the dead and defrauding family members had serious consequences. She asked them to find Robert guilty on all counts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson announced guilty verdicts on all counts: first-degree theft, forgery, criminal fraud, and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. Robert showed no reaction, just stared straight ahead while the verdicts were read. His wife sobbed. His children looked devastated. I felt no triumph, just a sad certainty that justice, while necessary, wouldn't heal the wounds Robert had inflicted. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the courtroom gallery, watching my brother stand before the judge to learn his fate. Victoria recommended a sentence of 8 years in prison, citing the sophisticated nature of the fraud, the substantial amount of money involved, and Robert's complete lack of remorse until he was caught. Marcus argued for probation, citing Robert's lack of criminal history, his family responsibilities, and his willingness to make restitution. Then the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I did. I stood at the podium and looked at Robert, who couldn't meet my eyes. I talked about our mother, about how she'd worked hard her entire life, saved carefully, and planned thoughtfully for her death so that her children would be provided for. I talked about how Robert had dishonored her memory by stealing the inheritance she'd intended to be divided equally. I talked about the betrayal I felt, not just the financial theft, but the emotional manipulation, the hugs at the funeral, the false expressions of love and solidarity, the year I'd spent believing my brother was someone he wasn't. I said that Robert hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my ability to trust. He'd stolen family gatherings and holidays and relationships with nieces and nephews. He'd stolen my mother's legacy of integrity and replaced it with a legacy of fraud. I finished by saying that I hoped Robert would use his time in prison to reflect on what he'd done and to become the person our mother had raised him to be. Then I sat down shaking and waited for the judge's decision. The judge spoke for 10 minutes about the seriousness of Robert's crimes. He noted that while Robert had no criminal history, the premeditated and sophisticated nature of his fraud demonstrated a deep moral failing that required significant consequences. He sentenced Robert to 6 years in state prison. Robert would also be required to pay full restitution, $400,000 plus interest to the estate, which would then be properly distributed to me. Additionally, Robert would be on supervised probation for 5 years after his release and would be prohibited from serving in any fiduciary capacity for the rest of his life. Robert was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. His wife was crying in the gallery. His teenage children looked stunned and devastated. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a profound sadness that it had come to this. My brother would spend the next 6 years in prison. His children would grow up visiting their father in a correctional facility. His marriage might not survive. His reputation was destroyed forever. But he had made his choices, and choices have consequences. The morning after Robert's conviction, my phone started ringing. The first call was from my Aunt Patricia. She was crying, torn between loyalty to her deceased sister's memory and sympathy for Robert. She asked if I was satisfied now that Robert was going to prison. I told her I wasn't satisfied. I was sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that Robert had made choices that destroyed our family. Patricia said she understood why I'd reported him, but couldn't I have found another way? Did it have to be criminal charges? I asked her what other way there was. Robert had stolen $400,000 and lied about it for over a year. He'd violated Mom's will and betrayed everyone who trusted him. Patricia was quiet. Then she said she'd pray for both of us. We haven't spoken since. The family fracture runs deep. My cousin David, Patricia's son, called next. He was angry, not at Robert, but at me. He said I'd torn the family apart, that I should have handled this privately, that airing our problems in criminal court was shameful and vindictive. I reminded him that Robert had stolen from Mom's estate, that if David's inheritance had been stolen, he'd want justice too. David said that was different, that family should forgive family. I said forgiveness didn't mean eliminating consequences, that Robert needed to be held accountable for crimes he'd committed. David called me cold and unforgiving, said I'd always been self-righteous and judgmental. The conversation deteriorated from there. We haven't spoken since either. Robert's wife, Jennifer, called 3 days after the conviction. She was calmer than I expected, resigned rather than angry. She said she knew what Robert had done was wrong, that she'd been shocked when she learned the truth, that she'd believed his lies just like I had. She said their marriage probably wouldn't survive this, that she couldn't trust him anymore, that she was humiliated by what he'd done, but she asked if there was any way I could ask the prosecutor to recommend a lighter sentence for the sake of Robert's children, if not for Robert himself. I told her I was sorry for what she and the kids were going through, that they were innocent victims of Robert's choices. But I couldn't ask for leniency. Robert had committed serious crimes. He needed to face appropriate consequences. Jennifer said she understood. Then she asked if I'd be willing to see the kids to maintain some relationship with my niece and nephew despite everything. I told her I would think about it, that I didn't want to punish the children for their father's actions, but I needed time to process everything. We ended the call with an understanding that we'd revisit the question later, after the sentencing, after some healing had occurred. The most painful call came from Robert's daughter, Emma, my 17-year-old niece. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She asked why I was doing this to her family, why I hated her father so much, why I wanted to take him away from them. I tried to explain that I didn't hate Robert, that I was hurt and angry about what he'd done, but this wasn't about hatred. Emma said I was ruining her life, that kids at school were talking about her father being a criminal, that she was humiliated and scared. She said her dad had made a mistake and deserved a second chance, that sending him to prison would destroy their family. I told Emma that her father had made many deliberate choices, not one mistake, that he'd stolen from his own mother's estate and lied about it for over a year. Emma said I was rich and didn't need the money anyway, that I was being greedy and mean. That hurt more than I expected. The accusation that I was motivated by greed, when Robert was the one who'd stolen nearly $400,000. I tried to explain that this wasn't about money. It was about honoring Mom's wishes and holding Robert accountable for violating the trust she'd placed in him. But Emma wasn't ready to hear that. She called me a horrible person and hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand, crying, wondering if I'd made the right choice. My husband Tom held me while I sobbed, reminded me that I had done the right thing, that Emma was 17 and upset and didn't understand the full situation, that someday she might. But in that moment, it didn't feel like I'd done the right thing. It felt like I'd torn apart what was left of my family.
The estate was finally settled properly 18 months after Robert's conviction.
A new executor was appointed who worked with Thomas Whitfield to reconstruct Mom's true financial picture and ensure accurate distribution. I received the full amount I was entitled to, approximately $270,000, after all legitimate estate expenses were paid. Combined with the $170,000 I'd already received, my total inheritance came to $440,000, exactly half of what Mom's estate was actually worth. Robert was ordered to repay the $400,000 he'd stolen, plus $70,000 in interest and fees. The money would come from the sale of his house and other assets. His family lost nearly everything. His wife had to sell their home, downsize dramatically, and go back to work full-time. His kids had to transfer to public schools, give up extracurricular activities, adjust to a much more modest lifestyle. I felt terrible for them. They hadn't committed any crimes. They were innocent victims of Robert's choices. I set aside money from my inheritance for my niece and nephew's college funds. It was what Mom would have wanted. The children shouldn't suffer for their father's sins. But I haven't spoken to Robert since the sentencing hearing. He's written me letters from prison, apologizing, explaining, asking for forgiveness. I haven't responded. I don't know if I ever will. Some betrayals are too profound to forgive. Some trust, once broken, can never be repaired. 3 years have passed since Mom died. Robert has served half of his sentence and will be eligible for parole next year. I've used part of my inheritance to pay off my house, fund my retirement, and secure my children's education. The money has made my life significantly easier, which is exactly what Mom intended. But every time I deposit a check or transfer money or think about my financial security, I remember how I almost didn't get it, how my own brother tried to steal it from me while pretending to love and support me. The inheritance came with a price I never anticipated, the loss of my brother, the fracturing of my family, the permanent mark of betrayal that I carry with me. I've learned some hard lessons over these past 3 years. I learned that family connections don't guarantee trustworthiness, that blood relationships don't prevent betrayal, that the people closest to you can hurt you most deeply. I learned that grief makes you vulnerable, that in moments of loss and sadness, predators, even familial ones, will exploit your trust. I learned that documentation matters, that you should verify, not just trust. That even with family, especially with money involved, you need to protect yourself. But I also learned that truth has power, that evidence speaks louder than lies, that systems exist to hold people accountable when they violate trust. The forensic accounting, the county records, the authentic documents, all of it combined to reveal Robert's fraud and ensure justice was served. I learned that legal protections exist for a reason, that fiduciary duty laws, fraud statutes, and criminal penalties serve important purposes in society. And I learned that justice, while necessary and important, doesn't heal all wounds. Robert will eventually be released from prison. He'll have paid his debt to society, legally speaking. But the debt he owes to our family, to Mom's memory, to the trust we once shared, that debt can never be fully repaid. Our family gatherings are smaller now, quieter. My aunt, Mom's sister, stopped speaking to Robert after the trial. My cousins keep their distance. Robert's own children have complicated feelings about their father. The family that Mom had worked so hard to nurture and hold together has been fractured by Robert's greed and lies. Sometimes I wonder if Robert thinks about that while he's in prison, if he regrets not just getting caught, but the actual act of stealing, if he understands what he destroyed. I wonder if he remembers Mom's funeral when he gave that beautiful eulogy about integrity and family values, if he feels shame about the hypocrisy of those words. I wonder if he thinks about the moment he created that first fake document, if he remembers making the conscious choice to betray our mother's wishes and steal from his own sister. I'll never know the answers to those questions, and maybe that's for the best. What I do know is this: being an executor is a position of profound trust and responsibility. When someone names you executor of their estate, they're trusting you to honor their wishes after they're gone, to treat their assets with respect, to be fair and honest with the people they loved. That trust is sacred, and when it's violated, the consequences extend far beyond legal penalties and financial restitution. Robert didn't just steal money. He stole peace of mind. He stole family unity. He stole the comfort of believing that the people you love will do right by you even when you're gone. Those losses can never be recovered. No amount of restitution can restore them. If you're ever named executor of a loved one's estate, remember that responsibility. Remember that you're holding someone's life's work in your hands, that you're honoring their final wishes, that the people trusting you are vulnerable and grieving. And if you're ever the beneficiary of an estate, remember that trust doesn't mean blind faith. That verification isn't an insult. That protecting yourself isn't paranoia. Get copies of all documents. Check public records. Ask questions. Don't assume that family means honesty, because $400,000 is a lot of money. And money, unfortunately, can corrupt even the people you think you know best. My mother saved carefully for 40 years so that her children would be provided for after she was gone. Robert tried to steal that provision and keep it for himself. He failed, justice was served, the money was recovered, but the family Mom worked so hard to nurture, that was destroyed. And no court ruling, no prison sentence, no amount of restitution can bring that back. That's the real tragedy of this story. Not the theft of money, but the theft of family. The permanent loss of trust, the relationships that can never be repaired.
Robert will be released from prison eventually. He'll try to rebuild his life, reconnect with his children, maybe even reach out to me.
I don't know what I'll do when that day comes. Whether I'll respond to his letters, accept his apologies, attempt some form of reconciliation. Part of me thinks I should. That mom would want her children to forgive each other, to maintain family bonds despite everything. But another part of me knows that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, that reconciliation doesn't erase betrayal, that some wounds leave permanent scars. Maybe someday I'll be ready to have that conversation with Robert, to hear him explain in his own words how he rationalized stealing from our dead mother and lying to his sister for over a year. But not yet, not while the anger still burns, not while I'm still grieving, not just one loss, but two, the mother who died and the brother who betrayed her memory. For now, I carry Mom's recipe box in my kitchen and her photo albums on my shelf. I look at pictures of our family from better times and try to remember what it felt like to trust without question, to love without suspicion. Those days are gone. Robert took them when he chose greed over integrity, money over family, lies over honor. The inheritance Mom left me has secured my financial future, but it came at a price I never wanted to pay. And that's a cost that can never be calculated in dollars and cents.
My name is Sarah Mitchell. My brother stole $400,000 from our mother's estate, lied to me for over a year, and destroyed our family in the process.
He went to prison for it. He's paying restitution. He's facing consequences. But the greatest consequence of all, the permanent loss of the family our mother worked so hard to create and preserve. That loss is forever, and no amount of justice can change that. Sometimes doing the right thing, reporting the crime, demanding accountability, seeking justice, comes with its own grief. I did the right thing. I'm certain of that. But it doesn't make the loss any easier to bear. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.